Hello and welcome to StratNews Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan. The disengagement process in Ladakh is well underway, and from all reports that we have, it's proceeding smoothly. There are no hitches. But at the end of the day, the disengagement is just that, a disengagement. The forces return to where they were previously before the crisis was triggered by the Chinese. So the core issue remains, how do you address the fact that China tore up no less than 4 agreements signed since 1993, all intended to ensure peace and tranquility on the line of actual control? That question remains unanswered, and I have with me a bite by General Y.K. Joshi, the Northern Army commander, who spoke to Editor-in-Chief Nitin Gokhale only yesterday. If you could just play this bite.
I would like a clarification of the LSE. That's the end result, what we're looking at. But given the present situation, once the disengagement happens, we have the flag meeting, we discuss the other friction areas, resolve those, and then we'll have to sit down at a higher level, at the diplomatic level, and look at new protocols. Since the Chinese, the PLA had sort of broken all the earlier, we have multiple agreements, which were signed to ensure that the status quo on the LSE remains, which they have broken. So we'll have to now look at new protocols.
Correct.
And post that, like I said, we have to look at the clarification of the LSE. Only then sort of we'll have some kind of peace on the LSE.
So there you have a clarification of the LAC. That's from our Northern Army Commander, General Y.K. Joshi, speaking to Nitin Gokhale. I'd like to bring in our guest for this evening, Professor Srikanth Kondapalli. He's a well-known China specialist in Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's a Mandarin speaker, wrote a book on the PLA Navy many years ago, I recall. Srikanth, welcome and thank you. What's your sense of, how do you read this entire disengagement, Srikanth?
It's a welcome move because for the past more than 1 year, there have been tensions on the border, pushing, shoving, and even killing on June 15th night. 20 Indian soldiers, 45 according to the Russian news agency TASS, and according to the American reports, 120 Chinese killed in this. So it has been a bad blood between the two countries. It augurs not so good for anyone in both the countries, and so I think this is a welcome move that they have started the disengagement process a few days ago, and this should be completed by this weekend. After that, as Raksha Mantri mentioned in the parliament, the other friction points will be taken up for consideration for disengagement. So overall, it is good for the bilateral relations to the extent that they have relaxed the border-related mobilization at the moment, and although that is no guarantee for future peace because of, as you mentioned, the main agreements before have been jettisoned by the Chinese, and so we have to now enter into a different ball game altogether. So that provides a certain uncertainty in the bilateral relations. What if the Chinese go away from the current agreement and mobilize again? So that would lead to more tensions.
So I want to ask you here, are the Chinese at all interested in clarifying the LAC? The general says that's what we want. Political leadership that says that's what we want. Are the Chinese interested?
In 2005, they have agreed to the 10 political parameters to resolve the territorial dispute, but the special representative mechanism is meant for defining the LAC, line of actual control, and they have conducted 20 odd meetings, and out of the 3 phases, they have crossed the 2.5 phases. So they are in the penultimate phase of clarification of the LAC. So hopefully they will come across a solution. Of course, you're right that we began the discussions on the territorial dispute in 1960. 3 discussions took place in Beijing, New Delhi, and Yangon, Rangoon actually, and later on from 1981. Since 1981 till 2019, 2020, we have had discussions, except during the Pokhran II year in 1998. So cumulatively, we discussed the issue of LAC for the past 36, 37 years. So hopefully this could be resolved in future. Ultimately, both India and China will have to have a defined LAC. When that will come is a big question mark, because they have shown reluctance. In all the territorial disputes, they resolved with the Russians, Central Asians, with Vietnam, Laos, and other countries. They have gained at least 50 to 60% of the claimed area, number one. Number two, when the other side is weaker, they have resolved the dispute very quickly, like the Central Asians or others. Thirdly, they have also put condition. For instance, Dai Pinko, the former special representative, mentioned if India is willing to give up Tawang, then only a territorial dispute resolution will be resolved, will be made. And since India will not give up Tawang, so we should expect for a long drawn time for the LAC clarification and ultimately the territorial dispute resolution.
Is it possible that we could take up other parts of the line of actual control separately, or are we insisting on a package settlement?
According to the official joint statements, it is a sector by sector approach, ultimately with the package deal. The package deal was suggested by the Chinese, and we suggested the sector by sector approach in the 1980s, early 1980s, 81, 82. So that is the position of both the sides. China is willing to solve from a political perspective, and they have some conditions. One is, of course, Tawang. Second is they also want a kind of agreement with India that it will not have relations with the United States or in any containment of China. So what the Chinese are asking for is a piece of India's foreign policy that is on independent decision making. So they want, with many of the agreements that they signed with other countries like Pakistan, Nepal, Mongolia, Central Asia, they have had this a word called mutual understanding. That word actually connotes that no anti-China activity or any coalition against China cannot be done. So it is an ironclad territorial dispute mechanism that they want. And since we did not agree to, we want to retain our strategic autonomy. And so there is no way we could have agreed to the Chinese position on that.
So that seems difficult. Now, in this immediate aftermath of the disengagement, what is it that you're picking up from the Chinese media, from your sources in China? What is the overall impression being conveyed internally in China?
I've been watching the Weibo and WeChat discussion in China, and the impression that I gather is there is a stoic silence on the part of the think tankers and scholarly community. They did welcome the parliament speech by the defense minister on the disengagement process. Also, previous to that was Senior Colonel Wang Qian's statement in the Ministry of National Defense in Beijing. So they have welcomed the move in general in public, but we have to see how it goes. Secondly, there is a elation at the news on India clearing up several investment projects in the infrastructure from China, investments from China. So that is a second aspect. So overall, they did welcome. Of course, the think tanks, scholarly community, or even officials, they have to go by the party state line in China. And that puts a constraint on them to openly discuss a lot of issues. Specifically, after seeing the visuals of demolishing the outposts or even the jetties or the other infrastructure that they have built between Finger 8 to Finger 5 in Pangong Tso Lake, That is very hard to swallow at the moment, but possibly over a period of time we could see their agreement in this. They are looking at the larger picture, where the Biden administration has given them some on the issues of Taiwan, South China Sea, on Tibet, and other aspects. So it looks like a climb down at the moment to in order to counter the US. So that is also one factor.
Mhm. So is this so? Assuming that the ties with the US don't go as the Chinese are planning, then the temperature could again go up. They could again on our side of the LEC.
It's quite possible because the Chinese officially mentioned that up to the Galwan area is their sovereignty,
Yeah.
and they have mentioned this word sovereignty for the first time. Previously, they used the word disputed territory, but now they have used the word sovereignty. So they they have indicated possibly in future this could be resolved through other means as well. So there is always the sword hanging on the territorial dispute.
Mhm. I have a question here from Aditya Kumar Singh, one of our viewers. What can India do to make sure that any further CPMs and protocols agreed upon is not put to dustbins like the previous one?
The CBMs that we signed with China in since 1993, they were with the assumption that let us prevent conflict. So the initial aspect of the CBMC is preventing conflict, but not building trust between the two countries. So
Yeah.
these two phases need to be looked at afresh. In fact, at the Xiamen summit meeting of the BRICS in 2017, there was a proposal for overhauling the CBM's approach between the two sides. Defense Minister Wei Fenghe visited 3 years ago New Delhi, and they also discussed the hotline between the commands. So that was one measure, but of course, we have seen a different line in China during the last 1 year. So as a result of this, we saw the uncertainty on the border. So what can be done? I think the proposed new CBM's approach could have some solutions, but we need to also add the trust levels, which is where a lot more has to be done.
I have another question from Anirudh K. Will it harm Xi Jinping's image when the CPEC, when the Communist Party meeting is in the coming few days? Has Xi Jinping's mood or image been affected by this resolution of disengagement?
Since the media and other communication channels in China are tightly controlled, so they would be able to paint a picture of victory in this current episode, because they would also have shown in the next phase of discussions on the friction points in Gogra Hills, the Depsang Plains, the Kailash Ranges, or in other areas in Galwan. They would have painted the picture that India retreated from these areas and painted a picture of victory. So that is one. The other is that Communist Party is adept at opening the tap and closing the tap at their will. So they view many of these issues in a tactical manner. So they would sell this to the public as well as a kind of victory. And in fact, the party congress itself could be a trigger for the current move, because they would not like to see any kind of casualty or any kind of criticism. Since they're going to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party in July, they would also need this interregnum to paint a different picture.
Interesting. So I have here a document dating back to 2013, Srikanth. I sent you a copy of that by the PLA Academy of Military Science. It was translated by the US-based China Aerospace Studies Institute. You're looking at that now. It's about the evolution of Chinese military thought with a lot of detail. What I found interesting was their analysis of India's military strategy. Now you had to look at this, Srikanth. What does it tell you of how they the amount of study they do on India and their understanding of India's strategy and how and its thinking?
The Academy of Military Science has an annual yearbook for several years, decades. And I collected several volumes whenever I visited China. And in these annual reports in relation to India, it is also about various countries. So there is a researcher who looks at the India portion. So since 1980s, they have three major positions on India. The Chinese military has three positions on India. Number one, India wants to be a global power, and they have the issue of becoming a global power mentality. That is number one. Number two is India is furthering hegemony in South Asia by blocking any South Asian country in terms of their independence, etc. Thirdly, they also say that the Indian influence in the Indian Ocean is increasing substantially. So these three positions I've seen since 1980s. So this document is nothing new from that point of view. And it also has a policy option. If India wants to become a global power, the Chinese military suggests to their government, party state, that India needs to be confined to South Asia. So when Hu Jintao visited New Delhi in 2006, there is a provision in the joint statement with Manmohan Singh that both countries will work together in Asia beyond the South Asian construct. However, we have not seen any concrete work between China and India in Asia, rest of Asia. So the original policy that the PLA suggested to the government still is intact, of confining India to South Asia by providing arms to Pakistan or now to Nepal, Bangladesh, or Sri Lanka or other countries. Number one. Number two, if India wants to be the hegemon in South Asia, they also want to support many of these countries. And if you look carefully at the joint statements between China and the other South Asian countries, China says that they want to protect the independence of these countries. So that is very specifically directed against India. Thirdly, if India wants to control the Indian Ocean, as they say, then China has a string of pearls policy of establishing bases like Djibouti, Jimani, Gwadar, and they had plans in Seychelles. Now, Hambantota port has been taken on a 99-year lease, and also other facilities in Myanmar or other places. So all these have some policy prescription. Secondly, they also suggest that because India has no territorial acquisition in any of the South Asian countries, India has no sovereignty claims on any of these countries. China also want to paint a picture of a big brother of India in South Asian region. Also as a pretext to push through the Belt and Road Initiative projects and subsequently for expanding China's influence in this region.
So after this disengagement, do you believe that these pictures of Chinese disengaging, destroying sangars, pulling out their heavy equipment, in a sense, is it the first time something of this kind has happened to the PLA?
Indeed. Of course, in Vietnam War in 1979, they marched some 50 kilometers inside Vietnam. In Long Son area, in other Cao Bang area, they have moved into Vietnam. But because the Vietnamese killed 45,000 Chinese in this area, so they have to remove all of that. So number one. Number two, in Korean War, they have moved closer to the 38th parallel, and after the offensive in the 4th and 5th campaigns in 1950-53, they came to a stalemate. Ultimately, they withdrew these forces in 1958 in Korea. Also, there were the Chen Pao Tao skirmish with the Soviet Union, although they did not cross these. But the Soviets at that time were complaining about the Chinese using some of the maritime areas for further expansion. So these are three incidents where this has happened. But in our living memory right now, This is the first time we see those visuals of China vacating all those areas it occupied in Pangong Tso Lake, in violation of all the agreements that you mentioned.
And I presume none of these pictures are playing out in China.
None of these pictures are playing out in China. And this is in sharp contrast to the South China Sea, where they have occupied these 9 reefs and built up huge military installations of nearly 2,000 acres of built up area, including airfields, Hongqi 9 surface to air missile batteries, or other infrastructure facilities. So this is a huge change in the PLA with the kind of pressure that India exerted.
So, how do you think this is being viewed in Southeast Asia and in our own neighborhood? Countries like Nepal, Sri Lanka, to a lesser extent, Bangladesh, perhaps?
During the Doklam crisis in 2017, the ASEAN had expressed concern and also in terms of a positive image of India. The Australian foreign minister at that time also had made a pro-India comment in terms of status quo prevailing. Likewise, the Japanese also made similar comments. So in the current round, we should be expecting more positive remarks. Already, the public opinion polls in Southeast Asia have indicated that in a conflict between China and the US, the ASEAN countries would be siding more with United States. Likewise, if we have a certain kind of conflict in future between India and China, India is seen more as a balancer, as former Singaporean Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong mentioned. So it is likely that this constituency would increase in its influence in Southeast Asia or even in South Asia. It is likely that this will have an impact on Pakistan as well or other South Asian countries in terms of negotiating with India.
So that's pretty positive, very positive. Yeah, tell me. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, please.
There's a Quad. There's going to be a virtual meeting of Quad foreign ministers. Now, Quad is something the Chinese have dismissed in the past. In the current context, is this something which would worry them even more?
Indeed, much of the Chinese wealth is in the maritime domain. Something like $4 trillion out of nearly $14 trillion of their GDP is on the high seas. Of course, under the 14th five-year plan, they wish to restructure their economy towards domestic consumption rather than dependence on the maritime region for import and export. Nevertheless, they are still dependent on the maritime region, which is controlled by the US aircraft carriers and its power projection forces. So the Quad is seen as in negative terms, as you mentioned. In fact, the foreign minister Wang Yi mentioned that this is like a sea foam. It would go back in a speech in Australia. He mentioned this some years ago. Nevertheless, there is still a concern for them because of the maritime focus of the Quad. The Quad has been focusing on these Indian Ocean and the Pacific. The weakness of the Quad is in the continental domain, and they have not said anything much about the continental domain, where we have the current standoff and also the disengagement process. So from the point of view of the current disengagement, Quad has marginal role, but in the overall strategic calculus of China, this is one that they want to win India away, and possibly this is also the time for them to have conducted the disengagement, so that they want to send a signal to India to distance from the Quad or the Indo-Pacific idea.
There's one question I want to ask you, Srikanth. It's actually relating to the border, to the boundary. The fact that the Chinese have always transgressed into our area and claimed various, parcels of land wherever. We don't seem to do the same thing. I mean, we have not gone in somewhere and said this is ours and sat there and made it an issue. Is this something that we don't do, or is something that how do you explain this? I'm talking of leverage, since we don't seem to do anything which gives us certain leverage vis-a-vis China.
In the current standoff, I came across some Chinese reports saying that, look, India had done the control of Tawang in 1951 by major cutting. So this should be a model for China as well. When China was busy with the Korean War in 1951-53, that was when Nehru sent the troops to control Tawang. So that is one the Chinese keep mentioning in the current context of the Galwan Valley and the other issues. Broadly, of course, this is an area of asymmetry in power relations. Secondly, after the 1962 border clashes, there has been a inward looking for India, and hence we have not crossed the line. We have not, of course, there were transgressions, but no occupation of territory has happened, as you rightly mentioned. So I think this is because of the 1962 border clashes. Indian armed forces could not get out of that syndrome for a long time. It is only after the Operation Checkerboard in 1987 and subsequently we began more confident. And the current, the Doklam crisis and the current crisis would also probably provide the Indian armed forces with the essential psychological kind of comfort level, and also, of course, it should be backed up by credible deterrence capabilities, both in conventional as well as in the strategic domains.
So, can India play perhaps a stronger game vis-a-vis, say, Tibet? Is that something which we can now think in terms of doing?
It's surprising that in the current situation of in the last 1 year, India did not speak the word T. And wherever there has been both T's, Tibet and Taiwan, or in other words, the one China policy. Although China had gone and provoked India by the 4 interventions in the United Nations Security Council on Kashmir, and former Foreign Minister Mrs. Sushma Swaraj also raised the issue of One India policy, positing it against the One China policy. Nevertheless, we have not spoken about Tibet or Taiwan in the current situation. So the signaling then is that we will settle this issue only based on the agreements that we sign and based on our strength, inherent strength, the deterrence capabilities, the Indian Army and the Indian Air Force, not based on other considerations like on Taiwan or on Tibet. So I think this has played out very well. The unified leadership as well as the deterrence capabilities that India exhibited, that is crucial. So without resorting to the threats of abolishing one China policy, India was able to do it on its own strength. So one of the things that comes out of the whole episode is India still has a lot in its leverage in addressing China.
Mm-hmm. So, last question. Going forward, what is it that you would like to see? Whether in terms of India policy towards China, we have already started liberalizing some of those investments we had blocked earlier. But looking ahead, what is that? What is the sense you get?
Overall, we see that the Asian landscape, Asian strategic landscape, is getting crowded in terms of the ambitions. We have seen since the 19th Party Congress in China, they want to occupy the center stage. And the 20th Party Congress due next year would probably endorse further assertiveness by China. So the jostling space in Asia is getting reduced. And that is where you have the Quad, you have the Indo-Pacific, you have the other understandings between India, Japan, Vietnam, and so on and so forth. So the space is getting reduced and increasing competition is visible in this area. So the Galwan effect as well as the other suggests that India needs to be more cautious. India needs to further strengthen its deterrence capabilities. India needs to further formalize, make efforts to formalize the LAC and resolve the territorial dispute so that we don't go into the next year, into the next decade with a conflict mode.
On that note, Srikanth, Kondapalli, thank you very much. Pleasure having you. And a loud thank you to all of you out there who've been following us with your comments and observations. Continue to track us on our website, on Instagram, on Telegram, on Twitter. And we look forward to your comments, observations, and your questions. Thank you all very much. Big thank you, Srikanth, Kondapalli.